Jeffrey, just checking you. Did you share the link onto Facebook yet?
I'm doing that right now.
Rad. Okay.
Well, take us away, Lachlan.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, I'm just gonna. Okay. Something here. Okay, that's not good. Oh, wait, I gotta just use things. Yeah, no, I know. I just gotta change my view gallery. There we go. Wait, no. Okay,
Yeah.
sorry. It's just having a bit of technical difficulties, which yeah, it's only showing myself on the Zoom on the Facebook live stream, but we'll just go from there. Okay. Hello, hi. My name is Lachlan Duncanson-Hales, and with me is my friend and colleague Torrin Maag. Say hello. Just so they know you're here, stuff like that.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Hi.
And we'll be your moderators this evening. Now, before we get started, we would like to acknowledge the traditional territory of Fishing and Anishinaabe, which was part of the 1850 Robertson-Huron Treaty, and to thank the United Church of Canada for sponsoring. Today, we're here to discuss the relationship between faith and politics and how they interact with one another in both a positive and negative way. And to that end, we have speakers, that being Daniel Blaikie, Rob Oliphant, and Garnett Genuis. And I believe we asked you to prepare a bit of an introduction. So starting with Mr. Blaikie and moving down the line, Garnett and Mr. Oliphant. Just share.
Sorry, are we? Do you want just some opening remarks?
Yeah, opening remarks. That's what we heard.
Sure.
Before. Yeah,
sure. Well, I'm Daniel Blaikie. I'm the member of Parliament for Elmwood-Transcona, which is in northeast Winnipeg, Manitoba. I'm a member of the New Democratic Party Caucus in Ottawa, and I'm a member of the United Church of Canada. I grew up at the Transcona Memorial United Church here in Transcona, and as it happens, my father was not only an ordained United Church minister, but also an NDP member of Parliament for the better part of 30 years here in Northeast Winnipeg. So certainly standing in both a strong religious and political tradition in terms of my own approach to faith and politics, and had the benefit of a strong role model in terms of how to try and blend one's personal faith and one's politics in a way that respects Canada's nature as a secular society, but also one where people have very strong religious commitments that help inform their view of what the country should be like and how our institutions ought to operate. I'll leave it at that in terms of opening remarks, and pass it on to my colleague, Garnett Genuis.
All right, well, thank you so much. It's a real honor for me to be with you today and participating in this forum. So my name is Garnett Genuis. I'm a Conservative member of Parliament from the riding of Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan in Alberta. Over the course of my relatively short life, I've attended a number of different kinds of churches. I grew up in a more sort of evangelical Protestant tradition. I spent a while attending a kind of mainline Protestant church when I was first living in Ottawa as a student. And I joined the Catholic Church about 12 or 13 years ago. So I have a little bit of a sense of let's say the different dialects of churchanese that people talk coming from different parts of the Christian tradition. And I'm certainly fascinated by interfaith dialogue and learning about other traditions as well. Maybe just kind of an opening thought on this question of the relationship between faith and politics. I took a Muslim political thought class in university, and one thing the professor said, and part of that class has always stuck with me, that he said that faith and politics are separate, but they are ontologically related. And in that sense, I think he's correct that they are often oriented towards a similar purpose. So they are separate activities. Both politics and religion aim at in different ways at establishing the conditions for human flourishing and for the advancement of justice. And so they can't help but try to understand each other a little bit because they are dealing with a relatively similar subject matter, and they inhabit the same world. They are institutions. They are concepts that pull us out of ourselves and call us to be engaged in the world for the advance of justice and for human well-being and human flourishing. Of course, there's much more to faith than that, but there's obviously a certain relationship between the two concepts. So I look forward to exploring that further in the discussion that we're going to have.
Yes, it's my turn. I'm Rob Oliphant, and I am a member of Parliament for Don Valley West, which is in Midtown Toronto. However, today I am coming to you as I'm sitting looking at a beautiful lake on the traditional territory of the Madawaska-Rini Algonquin people, and it's very good to be with you. A little bit about me. For almost for 37 years, I've been an ordained United Church minister. I know I look much younger than that. It kind of shocks me that it was 37 years ago that I was ordained. For 25 years of that ordination, I served as a pastoral minister in congregations across the country, from Newfoundland to Labrador in the east to Yukon in the northwest. I was in Yukon for 6 years, laterally 9 years in Toronto. For about 12 of those years, I was not in a pastoral charge, but I've always considered myself still in ministry. So whether it's ministry in politics as a member of Parliament or a ministry running a national health charity, I've always seen my faith and my ministry as being active as to who I am and what I am. I'm a gay Christian, and as such, obviously, the United Church has been a very comfortable home for me. Not always easy, but the United Church is definitely home for me, and it's been a place where I think my faith has grown, and my inspiration to be involved in politics was cultivated. And don't quote me on this, but I'm agreeing very much with Garnett at this point, in that faith and politics are, for me, almost seamless. They are part and parcel of my life, and it comes to me particularly from the social gospel. But I'm also very much theologically a Wesleyan Methodist. So I'll get into that later in what's called the long question a little bit later. Suffice it to say, I continue to participate in the National United Church and local congregation, but also represent one of the largest Muslim ridings, as well as one with a significant Jewish population. So I love the interplay, the faith dialogue, monologue, trilogue that is required for us to be in public life. So great, and thank you for doing this.
No problem at all. It's real. Honestly, I'm very happy that this was able to come together as it is right now. All of you kind of were touched upon interfaith, and I am aware that there is an interfaith caucus of which all three of you are a part of. And Mr. Blaikie, as the co-chair of that caucus, could you tell us, go in a bit of detail about what that caucus actually does and how that, what that group does in Parliament, how it operates and such?
Sure. Well, first I'll say that I'm co-chair along with Elizabeth May, who's not here this evening, but Elizabeth, along with my fellow MPs on the panel this evening, we're all instrumental in getting the Interfaith Caucus up and running. It's a relatively new organization, so we've hosted just the one event so far with some guest speakers, and really I think there's at least a twofold purpose to the group. So one is to try and create a space for members of Parliament to come together, kind of talk about how questions of faith intersect with some of the issues that come before Parliament, and to try and foster a dialogue on the Hill, as it were, about how we do that well and how we do that respectfully. And the other purpose of the organization is to try and help foster a bit of a wider dialogue within Canadian society for people of faith of all kinds who are also following politics and interested in politics and active in politics, to be able to extend that conversation beyond the confines of Parliament Hill. And and I think there have been, there are often examples of where whether it's become religion becomes a kind of political flashpoint for some reason. There are examples where we see religion as a site of conflict, and I think those always remind us of the need to constantly be very intentionally and actively working to try and understand across those religious divides, so that we can find a way both to find common ground and also to better understand some of the abiding differences and how to live well together in spite of some of those differences. So that's certainly what I see the mission of the Interfaith Parliamentary Caucus as being. And I would invite my colleagues, if there's anything that they want to add to that, to do so.
That seemed to me like an excellent description. If we could move on to our next question, how has your faith affected your policy making, and how has it guided your approach to politics more broadly? Because politics is of course more than just making policies. Mr. Oliphant, if you could start us off.
Sure. I guess for me, politics is the place where ideas and people come together. And when ideas and people come together, you've got different personalities, different backgrounds, different ways people have approached the world, and different ideas. And so when I work in the political sphere, I am always keenly aware both of our common and shared ideas and thoughts, but also our differences. What I think I've always tried to do, and I do it sometimes successfully and sometimes not, is to remember that our faith should guide us, should motivate us, but not always dictate what we're doing, because we're always growing, we're always learning. And I even watched in the Gospels, you can see a number of times where Jesus changes his mind. And it's quite an interesting phenomenon for me to recognize that I may not be right all the time. I may have to learn, I may have to listen, I may have to experience something differently. And for me, the church has always been the kind of place where I learned that. And I hope that I could, as one of the songs that we used to sing quite regularly, draw the circle wide, that the wider we draw the circle, so that if we're a group of all men, we're missing women and transgendered people and people who are non-binary. If we only have white people, we're missing people of color, Indigenous Canadians, Indigenous people from around the world. If we're only Canadian and Western, we need to keep drawing that circle wider so that we bring in people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, different geographic experience. And that circle needs to be big. And I try to remind ourselves that if we're going to do politics and do it well and be inspired by our faith, it's about drawing our circle wide. And then trying to struggle to form, if not a consensus, a set of ideas and inspirations and then legislation that we can agree to. And if not agree, we can be bound by, because we know it makes us all better. So that's sort of in general terms. And in specific terms, some of the things that I have worked on that have been driven by my faith, one would be medical assistance in dying. And I co-chaired that committee, that special committee, and have pushed the boundaries on ensuring that people have the right to have a medical assisted death. And that to me is a matter of faith. It's also caused me to work on a bill about genetic discrimination, to make it illegal to discriminate against someone because of their genetic makeup. It's also pushed me to co-author a bill on Alzheimer's and other dementias, and making sure that Canada has a strategy for that. So those are the kinds of things that have been bound up in either my theology or my faith background. And my theology and my faith background are blended, but they're not always exactly the same. So I think it definitely involves the way I try to do politics. And then not only the way I do politics, but what I do in politics is also guided by that. That's a beginning. I could go on for 2 hours about that question.
Thank you. So, Mr. Genuis, could you continue?
Sure. Thank you. And it's always so interesting to hear what my colleagues have to say, both identifying similarities and maybe points of slight difference. I mean, my grandmother was a Holocaust survivor, and her father was Jewish. She was Christian by confession, but identified as a Mischling or half Jew by the regime, and therefore marked out for persecution. She identified her survival as being largely because of the bold ministry of an anti-Nazi Catholic bishop in the area where she was, someone named Clemens August Graf von Galen. Von Galen was somebody who was in many senses in a position of privilege. He was a bishop, he was an ethnic German, he was an aristocratic background, compared to my grandmother, who was in a position of lacking privilege. And yet he used his position to speak in boldly challenging the regime in a way that was at odds with the tenor of the time, and that put him and others around him in great risk. But it established by speaking out for justice, for human dignity, he was able to create the conditions in which other people in that area were willing to shelter someone like my grandmother. And so she spent the final years of the war kind of hiding out on different farms and being able to survive. And this is an example I draw from significantly, because I think you can look at someone like von Galen or someone like William Wilberforce, who was deeply motivated by faith, speaking out against the slave trade, and you can identify the way in which people told them to get with the times. Why are you bringing your faith into politics? You should get with the times. You should. And there were people of faith at the time who were using their faith to justify kind of going along with the existing tenor of the systems. Of course, we know that the Christian faith in particular, but other faiths have been used to justify all kinds of terrible things that I think run counter to gospel values. So. I think being a person of faith isn't a guarantee that you're gonna get it right in politics, obviously, but it is our doctrines point to a commitment to the universal dignity and value of the human person, and I think there are many instances of people who are inspired by faith, who have been active in politics, who have challenged the spirit of the age, who have challenged the tenor of the times, to stand up for a commitment to the idea of universal human dignity and value, the dignity and value of all life at all stages, regardless of circumstances, regardless of whatever social context deems some people, some lives, some circumstances less valuable. I think faith should be the inspiration to courage, to be willing to be a a contrarian and a gadfly in a loving and just way, recognizing the value of all human beings. And also, I think it's important to say that it really comes down to what you believe to be the truth, and to speaking for the truth in politics. I believe that truth can often be accessed from different directions. That what is true according to our faith is not going to contradict what is true according to science. Is not going to contradict what is true according to a true enlightened spirit of humanism, and so there need not be conflicts between different sources of truth if we're maybe delving far enough into the data and the facts in each case. But faith can be a basis for challenging social consensus in the name of truth and justice, and I try to think in those terms, because as I said, the history of my own family, of my own grandmother, if it wasn't for people inspired by faith, willing to speak into the political reality, if it wasn't for that, then I wouldn't be here today.
Thank you for that. That was really enlightening. Mr. Blaikie.
Sure. I'll maybe start by saying that, it's partly a function of my faith that I'm in politics at all. And of course, there are people for whom their faith counsels avoidance of politics altogether. And so, being raised in the social gospel tradition, not only meant that I felt free to participate in politics if that's what I wanted to do, but also that I felt a sense of obligation to be involved. And that comes from a sense that, one of the important things that Jesus taught was that the love of your neighbor can't be separated, I think. And so this is both a political point of view, but also a theological point of view, that it can't be separated from noticing and being aware of and being willing to challenge the different kinds of power structures that exist in the society that you live in. And I think there's some affinity there with what Garnett was just saying, although we might ultimately parse it differently. Certainly there's an importance of recognizing how the authorities of the day, and I don't just mean government, and I think that's important, but money and other forms of power, how those things serve to put people down and exclude people and make it harder for people to participate in society. And so I come from a faith tradition that really emphasizes the importance of speaking truth to power and being willing to challenge power structures in order to affirm the dignity and the value of everyone as part of the love that we're called to feel for our fellow human beings. And so that's certainly, part of my motivation for political participation. I think it's also a kind of a sense of imperative to participate in some way, and that doesn't just mean running for office. There's all sorts of ways that people can participate in political discourse that don't involve running for public office. That's the way that I chose to do it for the present time, but it's certainly not the only way. And so I think that's part of it. My faith very much is a faith that is about involvement in the world and working to make it better, not just for myself or for my family or for my friends, but for everybody in my community, understood, as Rob was saying, in that largest possible sense of always trying to be drawing that circle wider and wider and wider.
Thank you so much for these insights. Lachlan, you have the next question?
Yes, I do. Yes, and these are things I haven't really thought about that much, but hearing them said today, as what has been said so far has been very useful and makes me just more excited for what we get up to further on. And this is more going to a group, but as a group, where have you all found tension between your own faith and politics itself? So Mr. Genuis, if you could begin with start us off.
Sure. Well, I think this is most obvious probably in the case where there are conflicts between conscience and what one sees as the strategic opportunities or strategic imperatives. I think it's important to say that this conflict is not unique to people of faith, because there are people who are non-believers who have a deep sense of what they ought to do in a particular situation, whatever the source of that is, but they still have a sense that, it is, one ought vote this way, right? And yet the pressure from the party is to vote the other way. These are very real conflicts, and they can be difficult to navigate. And I do sometimes get asked the question, what happens if your constituents want one thing and your faith points in another direction, or what happens if your party, or all these things kind of, and I think it is important to acknowledge that those conflicts are not unique to believers, again, but they are part of, I think, what any good person experiences in politics. Because if we're just there to read the tea leaves, if our purpose in politics is to be really good at reading the room, then we're all wasting our time, right? I don't see any reason to take red-eye flights and be away from my kids so that I can demonstrate my skill at reading the room, right? So these things are often manifest as conflicts between maybe faith and politics. I mean, more precisely, they're conflicts between conscience and politics. But I think these are important areas to delve into. And in the Catholic tradition, we talk about the importance of right formation of conscience, right? That conscience isn't just like, I feel like doing this or I feel like doing that, but it's an attempt to diagnose the right and just action in a particular context that comes through reading and reflection and study. And I do think that in this context, the famous quote from Edmund Burke is important, that a politician owes his representatives not his industry only, but also his judgment, and he betrays instead of serving them. I'm not getting the quote precisely right, but the point is, he said, as a parliamentarian, your job is not just to what you owe your constituents is not just industry, but it's judgment. You should exercise your judgment, and by all means communicate that judgment and seek feedback from your constituents and others. But it's to think about the problems that are in front of you, and to try to diagnose them according to what is right and just. And I guess for me, I believe in the alignment of truth, that what is true according to reason and justice is going to align with what is true according to my faith.
Thanks for that. That is very much insightful. And yeah, I can see how. Sorry, ADHD being doubled again. But I can see how trying to find the interplay and trying to navigate that kind of between faith and politics is hard sometimes and stuff like that. So if Mr. Blaikie, if you could continue off that point.
Sure, and I would certainly echo Garnett's point that this is not a challenge that is unique to people of faith, but that that it can happen, whatever the source of your strong feelings of right and wrong. Those can sometimes come into conflict with the various kind of pressures that exist in political life. I've been fortunate not to experience any kind of acute conflict between the position of my church, as it were, and the position of my party. But I maybe just different, but in the sense that Garnett was raising the issue of secular people also experiencing some of these conflicts. What I would also say is that sometimes these difficult questions, and I'm thinking, Rob had mentioned earlier medical assistance in dying. Sometimes those difficult issues, which can sometimes be cast and rightly cast, depending on the person and the organizations involved, as a conflict between faith and politics. Sometimes it's just the case that those issues are controversial, both within political communities and faith communities. And I think medical assistance in dying was an example of that. And even where a church may take a position as an organization, you still have people, members of the church, who have differing views, and there's a live debate. between what they feel the position of their church ought to be, or whether their church ought to have a position. And so, I think that's another way that sometimes those difficult questions of faith and politics are lived out that don't get a lot of attention, or it's not often talked about in that way. That in fact, you could be experiencing a challenge or a crisis within your own faith community about what the best approach is, or what is prescribed. So it's not always clear. There's room for legitimate theological debate about some of these important issues. It's not like the religious answer is always crystal clear and it's obvious what that is, or that faith prescribes one particular way of looking at things. That's sometimes how it's portrayed, and there are people in politics who sometimes come from a faith community where there is a very decisive answer, and so people then think that that must be true across the board, when in fact it isn't. And so sometimes those difficult political debates are also playing out within particular faith communities. And I think that's an important part of the puzzle that isn't often talked about. And you don't see that come up in Parliament, because I think, and I think rightly, members of Parliament have a duty to communicate with all audiences, not just people in their own faith community, and to justify government policy based on arguments that can hold with reasons that can be good to people outside of their own faith community. And I think that's where we can talk about a distinction between public reasons and private reasons. And so the debate in Parliament often reflects rightly what the public reasons for a decision are, and that can kind of mask some of the controversies within any given faith community or between faith communities about a particular issue. So I would just add that component to the conversation that I think often gets passed over.
I guess I will just build on both of those comments. I think in very much agreement in that, as Daniel said, it's not just people of faith, but it could be anybody from a secular position, from an atheist or agnostic position that is struggling with trying to discern what is right or good. And it's also not just in politics. It's in industry, it's in business, it's in society, it's in our neighborhoods. It's this is the human dilemma. And for me, what scripture, what both Hebrew scriptures and Christian scriptures are about, is that wrestling from what people have perceived as God's call, the divine call, the call of faith to real world living. And that real world living can happen anywhere. It can happen in our homes. It can happen in our streets and in our neighborhoods. It can happen in business. My first career was as an accountant. And my third career was running a not-for-profit, a charitable organization. And I would say that you wrestle with doing the right thing, no matter where you are in life. And politics is just one of those venues. One thing that I have found helpful on that is the tradition that the United Church has been built on, largely, even though we're Presbyterian and Congregationalist and Methodist. I think the dominant theology that has come into the United Church that has shaped me is from John Wesley. And I often talk about the Wesleyan quadrilateral. So Google that, folks. You can find it. I think it's a great little tool. And it talks about 4 things that Wesley used when he was wrestling with a decision or trying to get an opinion on something. It could be a political one or a personal one. And he said, scripture is critically important. So is tradition. So is our experience, and so is reason. So those 4 things need to be in conversation with each other. So when I have a dilemma and I'm looking at a problem, I look to see where scripture is going to inform me. And sometimes it doesn't, because scripture is often conflicted. You can have plowshares beaten into pruning hooks and pruning hooks beaten into plowshares. Both of those are in the Bible. But I still go back to the Bible first. And then I go to tradition. that long history of tradition, which is from the early church right through the Roman Catholic tradition and the Eastern tradition, as well as the Protestant Reformation. Then I think about it, my reason, like I add intelligence and the sort of discernment that Garnett was talking about as well, that you have to think about these things and bring in that expertise and science and all of those things, but then also your personal experience, what it means to live through these things. And a woman's experience might be different than a man's experience and from a non-binary person's experience. And so you have to bring all of that in. And in the end, you live with knowing that ultimately we'll come up with the best possible idea on any policy issue. We'll try to make the world better for people. And in the end, where we've made mistakes, we count on forgiveness. We count on trying to have others forgive us as well as God to forgive us. And that's what we do. And we pick ourselves up and try it again and take scripture and tradition and reason and experience, make decisions, sometimes get it right, sometimes get it wrong. But I don't see this as something that is bothersome. This is just life. And every character in the Bible, whether it's Nicodemus on through the woman at the well, through all of these people, were struggling with what it means to be human, what it means to be called by God, what it means to live in community, what it means to try to make a difference in the world. Politicians get put under the spotlight, but this happens in your school, it happens in your workplace, your family, it happens everywhere. We're not that special, we politicians. We hate to admit it sometimes, but we're not that special. We're all kind of trying to figure it out. And I often use the metaphor, it's about one beggar telling another beggar where to find food. And we all come to faith trying to get a little bit of nourishment to keep going, because life isn't easy. Life is often rocky. So there we are.
Thanks for that. And through this, I've got more of an understanding of how the politics and faith have interacted. And you're right, politicians aren't that special, and a lot of politicians come up just through, or what I've seen in the local Sudbury area for Torrin and I from, basically politicians they don't come from like a background in poli-sci or stuff like that. It's more just trying to do the best that you can with the tools you're given. For what I see.
That's why we call it the House of Commons.
Exactly.
The House of Commons. We are people. That's what we are.
Yes. And I'm going to pass it on to the person who's a bit more of a grasp on the intricacies of faith understanding, because he's going to school for it.
Okay.
Torrin, do you want to bring to the quote unquote
Yes.
long question?
It is the long question time we've all been waiting for. The point I'm trying to get at here is there a place for religious disobedience in Canada? But I'd like to go through some context first. So the relationship between religion and the state is complicated, to massively understate it. In Canada, the state supports certain religious groups in certain ways, example with publicly funded Catholic schools here in Ontario, and limits them in others, example through laïcité laws, which ban public servants from displaying religious symbols. Similarly, religion and religious groups both support and undermine the state. For but one example, some churches actively encouraged the war effort during the World Wars, while other groups such as Mennonites encouraged outright disobedience to the law because they were against conscription. As these examples show, some religious beliefs and practices will always be in tension with those of the secular state. The issue is how, or even if, these tensions can be reconciled. After all, both religion and the state demand complete adherence from their subjects. Within their own worldview, each understands itself as the ultimate authority. So this puts the religious citizen in an interesting position. While the two systems mostly coexist most of the time, conflicts sometimes occur. One's faith may lead one to an action that the state forbids, or the state causes one to act in a way antithetical to one's faith. In the words of the Right Honorable Beverly McLaughlin, the religious citizen is trapped in a dialectic of normative commitments. From the perspective of the state, the issue is clear. We may at most accommodate your religious practices within the law, but at the end of the day, you must obey. From the perspective of religion, the issue is also clear. We may at most accommodate the law within our religious command or our religious community, but at the end of the day, you must obey the divine. Yet for the religious citizen caught between these two, the issue is murky. Who should I obey? In the rare edge case, when religion and law cannot be reconciled, what are we to do? So often the religious citizen chooses to follow religious demands over secular ones. This religious disobedience has been a driving force in resisting many unjust laws and governments. For but one example, religious disobedience was famously promoted by Martin Luther King Jr. as the key to nonviolent revolution. According to him, obeying an unjust law, such as segregation, is straight up disobeying the law of God. It is blasphemy, idolatry. And he and his supporters were imprisoned, beaten, and killed by the state for living out their faith like that. As religious MPs, you are not only under the law, but also direct actors upon it. So back to the question at the start. Is there a place for religious disobedience in Canada? If so, is there a way for the state to make space for it, to acknowledge and cede power perhaps to another system of ethical authority? If not, why and how do you reconcile that with your faith? Mr. Blaikie, would you want to lead us?
Sure. Well, I'll maybe start by saying I'm going to make no pretension to solving this matter once and for all, but I do appreciate the question because I think it's an important one, and I think it's an important one not just generally speaking, but also one for legislators to reflect upon. It seems to me, and this again is a particular position, so I don't pretend that this is obvious or that everyone will agree. But that there is, as much room for religious disobedience in Canada as there is for other kinds of civil disobedience. And I think this harkens back to Garnett's point about the fact that, people can experience serious tension between, imperatives of faith and imperatives of politics or imperatives of the state, whatever you might like to call them in this particular instance, regardless of whether they're people of faith or not. And so sometimes those issue in acts of disobedience, and typically, people are doing that in order to make a point. So I think it's fair to say, for the purpose of this, conversation, we're not interested in just kind of vandalism. We're talking about politically purposeful acts of disobedience. And in the case of religious disobedience, it seems to me that at that point, that religious feeling and those religious imperatives are taking on some kind of political import, or they wouldn't issue in disobedience, and they become political issues, because the question, of course, is what do you do with that? There have been times where Canada has been able to accommodate that, and you mentioned the example of the Mennonites, where you had a very explicit religious accommodation, and Mennonites were not required to participate in the way, and they had some guarantees against conscription that did not apply to the rest of the Canadian population. So I mean, there you see some accommodation. So is it possible? It absolutely is. It's always, these things are always political questions, and I think when there's an important disobedience at stake, the conversation has to be in some way, what is at stake in the issue? And this is where that, religious conversation also becomes a political conversation. I think just the fact of disobedience alone isn't necessarily enough to say that there should be some kind of draconian response. I think we should be looking to ask, what we can accommodate. Is it possible that there are certain kinds of protests that simply cannot be accommodated? That may be, but it's always hard to say in advance what those are, and there'll have to be a discussion at the time about, what's at stake. I mean, those are some of the conversations that have been had in Canada recently when it comes to gathering at churches, for instance, during the pandemic. So these aren't abstract issues by any means. And the question is, what can you accommodate? I think the goal should be to try and accommodate what you can, and to be very clear in your reasons for what people think simply can't be accommodated. I think it's hard to say, well, there's just a kind of blank check on religious disobedience, and as long as you have a religious reason for your disobedience, anything goes. So this is where, and I think, some of my colleagues earlier were talking about how, some of these issues end up being about similar things. Like at a certain point, there's enough overlap between what faithful conversations and political conversations are driving at, that you can't get around that conflict. And so at that point, you have to have that conversation. We've been trying to have that conversation in Canada around issues during the pandemic. I don't know that we've done it to any kind of gold standard. There's a certain amount of muddling through, to be sure. But you muddle through, I think, and this is partly, a product of my own faith and my own thinking from that point of view, is that you're to the extent that you have to muddle through, you're trying to do that with the goal of coming to some way to live together and to share a space and to accommodate one another despite differences. Sometimes it can be quite frustrating. You don't always have to feel warm fuzzies about the people that you're accommodating. Those differences can be very real. But part of, from my own faith perspective, part of what you're trying to do is to find that place where you can live together and you can share a space, whether that's a local community or something as big as a nation or a planet. And so you're entering into those conversations with the goal of trying to figure out how it is that you can live together despite some pretty clear and important differences, in the hope of finding enough common ground that you can do that peaceably and eventually perhaps grow together to come to a better common understanding. But these things take time. So I don't think there's a simple answer to this question at all, as the moniker long question suggests. But I hope that gives you a little bit of a sense of some of where I'm at on that, and I'm sure my colleagues will have more to add.
Yes. Does anyone else like to share their thoughts here?
I think I'm going to build a little bit on where Daniel was. When he started out, obviously he said that he was going to be clever about this, and he sounded very much like Jesus. Now, don't put that on your brochures, Daniel. But when you come to a question like this, you have to go back to the Gospels, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have the story of people going to Jesus and asking him this question, or they ask it, is it lawful to pay taxes? And a little bit different in Matthew and Mark than in Luke. Matthew and Mark, they're called religious. They're called the Pharisees or urban Herodians. And in Luke, they're spies sent by teachers of the law. Who knows who they were? But regardless, Jesus was too clever to be trapped, much like Daniel just was. Jesus was not going to get into this, because if he said it was, lawful to pay taxes, then a religious following would be upset with him. And if he said it wasn't lawful, you didn't have to pay your taxes, he would be in trouble with the state. So everybody knows he took the coin and he grabs the coin and says, whose picture's on that? And they said Caesar's picture. Well, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's. Now, for 2,000 years since then, people have been saying, what the heck was he talking about? How does this work? And so you look at, right from St. Augustine all the way through centuries of theology, and it's a wonderful study to see how this has evolved over time. Jesus was understanding very much, I believe, that if you take advantage of the state, you've got roads that are paved, you've got services that are provided. It's somewhat hypocritical to not pay your taxes. But he also points to things that are saying, but those aren't the most important things in life. What are the most important things in life? And he that's qualified in other parts of the Gospels are what belong to God. And so render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, which is only money and stuff like that. Render unto God what is God's, which is your heart, which is your spirit, which is your soul, which is your caring, which is your love, all of those things. And it's, I think that it is asking the question about civil disobedience is not as important as to asking what it is you would be disobedient about. What authority are you acting on? We're not God. You know, truth, what is truth? And that's, you know, a wonderful scriptural question in John's gospel. What is truth? And when you see Jesus as Christians, we're looking at truth because he's embodying truth. But we're not truth. We will always only have an approximate understanding of truth. We'll never get it all. One of my favorite authors is a guy named Ed Sanders, E.P. Sanders, who was a Baptist theologian. And if you look at his book, Paul and Palestinian Judaism, and you look in the index for truth, comma, absolute, you go to page, I don't know, it's 262 or something, you turn it, it's one of those blank pages between the chapters. I love that because we will never know absolute truth. We're not God. So we muddle around trying to get close to truth and trying to do it. So civil disobedience, I'm cautious about that. I'm cautious when I hear about it. I mean, Gandhi had a very interesting interpretation of this scripture. Martin Luther King Jr. had an interesting one. The Mennonites and the Quakers had interesting ones, all serving their purposes. I'm cautious. I'm always cautious about going out too far because, like Jesus, I like to try to follow Jesus the best I can, or Daniel Blaikie. I don't want to get trapped on that question. Because I think that there's a bit of a trap in it. And what we need to do is walk cautiously and carefully and humbly. So then you can, you know, go back to Micah, you know, what does God require of us but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with God. That's about all. If we get that done, we're doing pretty well. Love, do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God.
Okay, well, maybe I'll jump in and pick up, but respectfully disagree slightly. I mean, I think Rob has asked an important question, which is, you know, recognizing we are not God, and also recognizing that we are made in His image. Can we still know the truth, and can we be confident in our actions with respect to the truth, or does humility oblige us to always preserve a certain margin of uncertainty in how it informs our actions? And I don't mean to put words in anybody else's mouth here, but I mean, it was Bertrand Russell who said, I believe it was Bertrand Russell who said, I would never give my life for something because I might be wrong. I don't agree with that. There are things I would give my life for. There are cases in which I would stand against the power of the state and say, you know, within my power to say no, I say no. And again, I am glad that Von Galen was willing to do precisely that, to engage in disobedience of the state, to stand up for the life and dignity of my grandmother and others who were like her. I think one can, with great humility, say that I am not God. I don't choose the truth. but it is through God's revelation to us that we have been given the truth, and that truth on certain fundamental questions that we can know, such as the immutable dignity and value of the human person, the importance of standing for justice. I wanted also, and I'm unlike Rob, I'm reading all these extraneous quotes, not from scripture, right? But this is from Benjamin Disraeli's great novel Coningsby. Benjamin Disraeli was a British prime minister in the 19th century. And the quote is, "But what is an individual?" exclaimed Coningsby against a vast public opinion, asking essentially, how can an individual stand against public opinion? What is an individual? "Divine," said the stranger. "God made man in his own image, but the public is made by newspapers, members of parliament, excise officers, poor law guardians." And he later says in the same book, "The spirit of the age is the very thing that a great man changes." I think that acknowledgement of the need for a person committed to justice and human dignity to stand against the spirit of the age, it can coexist with great humility. It can coexist with a sense that it is not from myself that I have the strength to oppose the, as Disraeli calls it, the spirit of the age, but it is from a sense of the divine image that is in all of us. So when it comes to a prospective conflict between truth on the one hand and man-made law, if the question is on a moral absolute, I would think anybody of conscience, religious or not, would see no contest between those choices. And again, that's clear to me, reflecting on the example of someone like von Galen. And I think there are cases today where we have to ask those same questions. Cases today when, for instance, we deal with we deal with, and this isn't a case of civil disobedience, but there are policy issues that we contend with, such as recognizing when we see an ongoing genocide in our world today, the need for stronger legislative frameworks to prevent the importation of slave-made products into the Canadian market. I think these issues, respectfully, are quite clear-cut. But when it comes to the question of civil disobedience, I think it's just important to note as well that this question is sort of answered definitively by our own legislative frameworks, who acknowledge that the primacy of freedom of religion and conscience, that individuals should be able to opt out of practices or activities when they conflict with their conscience. That's not only an individual holding up their commitment to their faith or their conscience, but that is a right given to us by our constitutional framework. So there should not have to be a conflict as long as our legal frameworks, which protect conscience, continue to be in force and fully enforced.
If I may ask a follow-up question.
Yeah.
So first, I would like to point out that Bertrand Russell was imprisoned by the state for refusing to be conscripted into the army as a pacifist. Sorry, that's just my philosophy trivia. Second is
it is him. He is the source of that quotation, is he not? Though I mean,
I think so.
Okay, yeah. So he was willing to disobey, but not take it all the way, I suppose, is the point.
I wonder if he was speaking in jest. He was an interesting figure. But anyway, the point I was thinking of listening to your comments was that to me this seems all very individualized, like one moral person, which is how I framed the question, how I framed my trap, as Mr. Oliphant put it. One individual person underneath like a moral law and having to make a decision there. But I find that many religious controversies, especially ones involving non-Christian peoples in Canada, are based more around group identity. So for example, I brought up laicite earlier, and it's been on my mind a lot since I'm from Quebec. This is not only a matter of an individual trying to make a decision, but it's actually a whole group of people who are trying to live within the law and also trying to live within their own community. And I was wondering if how you might see a more communal concept of religion, how that might influence our ideas about disagreement. For example, or even when I was talking about the Mennonites, this was a group as a whole that was disobeying the law, not only individual people who felt it was against their conscience.
Maybe I'll let me start on that. I think the group dimension of faith is obviously incredibly important. Conscience is ultimately individual, right? And when we talk about the rights of groups, very often what we mean by that is the sort of aggregate expression of individual rights, right? So if we talk about the right of religious societies not to be compelled to participate in activities that go contrary to their mission, for example, like my view is that that's an important thing to protect, but that is not a right of the group as such. It is a right of the individuals who are part of the group. It is a right of the individuals who are members of the board, donors, employees of that group, the rights of those who may be serviced by that group, who wish the group to be true to its mission. So what might look like the rights of groups when they're asserted, it's often on the basis of the rights of individuals within those groups. So, I mean, I do see the questions, for instance, of Bill 21 in Quebec, the questions of conscientious objectors during wartime, as well as being these are obviously individuals that are part of communities, but they are asserting a right of conscience, which is I think this distinction is important because, so for instance, the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights article on religious freedom makes specific mention, and rightly so, of the right for an individual to change their religious belief. In some points of discussion, when we emphasize too much the rights of a group, the risk is that right of a group gets interpreted as somehow being a right to prevent individuals from within the group from opting out of the group. So you get, for instance, there are many places around the world where we see things like anti-conversion laws, and I think all of us here would rightly fiercely oppose those kinds of provisions because as the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights recognizes, a right of religious freedom is the right of an individual to look into the world, look to God, look at themselves, come to conclusions about where their conscience is leading them, and to follow those conclusions, even if that means leading them out of one community and into another community or into the middle of nowhere. And so, I mean, yes, communities are important, but they are extensions of the rights of individuals within those communities.
Do either of you other speakers, do you have any comments or follow-up on those points, or disagreements, of course?
Of course I do, but I'm happy to have Daniel go first.
Of course,
I'll go for hours.
Why don't you go ahead? I'll follow you for a change, Rob.
Okay. First on Bertrand Russell. It was interesting. In my family, my mother was Christian and was United Church and a church attender and a woman of deep faith. And my father was an atheist. And we had the option on Sunday morning of going to church with my mom or staying at home and listening to opera with my dad, and probably getting a lecture about Bertrand Russell. And to avoid opera, and it was probably a mistake of my life, I went to church. And but my father, as an atheist, was extremely principled. And like Bertrand Russell, I think he was a bit tongue-in-cheek on the question of what he would not die for, because his autobiography was all about what he lived for. And he lived for three things: for the longing for love, for the quest of knowledge, and for the alleviation of suffering in the world. And I can't think of anything more noble than that. And he was, an atheist. And so I got the love of all those things from my dad and my mom equally. I just happened to find my root in the church, and that's where I am. I also think nothing is always as true to us as it may be to someone else. And we can even say we're created in God's image. We have a divine preference. Say that we don't take it with a grain of salt. You have to take it like that with a grain of, because God, from the sky's image, I see my internet connection's unstable. God is speaking now. We decided that because we can be very egocentric as people. No matter how much we talk about doing something in humility, when we state it as an absolute, it's arrogant. It's just arrogant. And we can talk about humility, but we have to do it. We walk that way individually. I walk as part of a community because I'm helped. I am not able to do everything myself. So it's my community of friends. Growing up as a gay person, I needed a community that would validate me and say, I was not wrong. I was not evil. And the church did that for me. My church did it for me and loved me. And I try to think, we walk away together and we try our best. I'm getting pressured right now from the United Church on universal basic income, UBI. It's something I've believed in since I was a teenager. I fought for what was then called guaranteed annual income. At my core, I believe in it. But I also know that no one government program is going to solve all the problems. So how do we live up to the values that everyone in society has enough to live on? Maybe it's through UBI. My church thinks it is. Maybe it's through a bunch of benefits to make sure people don't fall through the cracks. I don't know yet. I'm trying to figure that out, but my church is pushing me, and I want my church to push me hard. And some days I'll push back. Some days I won't. Some days I'll say, you were right and I didn't know. And some days maybe I'll be right. So we try. But, when people say, even when they say, stand on your own 2 feet, I've never stood on my own 2 feet. I've stood on the backs of a community of saints from generations. And hopefully someone will be lifted up by me at some point. That's the goal. And maybe I was wrong. We'll see.
Well, if it's all right, Rob, I'll follow you, but I won't liken you to Jesus. I do want to circle back a little bit on the conversation about the role and the place of religious disobedience or civil disobedience. I think one of the things that's really important to recognize, and I think there has been some recognition of it already in the conversation, is that to the people for whom disobedience becomes an imperative, that they feel compelled to do that, whatever that may be. That comes from a strong place of being motivated by certain values. And of course that's not definitive at all, because, we can strongly disagree with the actions. We can strongly disagree with the values that motivate that activity. But I think, when Garnett is talking about the right to religious freedom, of course, in the Western tradition, one of the great sources, perhaps not the only one, but an important source of that right, as it exists not just in Canada, but also in Canada, it comes out of the Protestant Reformation and the very real conflicts that ensued from people who had a very strong sense of what they felt was right, and a very strong sense of, how to the importance of their religious differences, or in that case, their denominational differences, and what they felt that justified them in doing. And the consequences were quite destructive. And it took a long time for folks to learn, and we're always at risk of unlearning those lessons. That when people get so entrenched in a particular point of view without a willingness to try and understand another point of view, or at least to accept, in the very old sense of toleration, that they had to live beside people that they were just never going to agree with. How do you do that? Well, one of the ways to do that was to develop the idea of a right of religious freedom. So that comes from a place of trying to learn how to live alongside people that we accept we're never going to totally agree with, even on some important issues. And the rights discourse that has developed in Western culture owes an important part of its tradition to those things. So I think it's important to recall that. Now, in any particular case of disobedience, and I'm maybe just coming back to what I was saying before, though, I mean, I think these are questions of perhaps religious difference that become political questions, and you can't say in advance what's going to work or what's not, or what people, the limit of what people can do and what they can't do, because of course, as a political question, part of what they're doing, I think, if oftentimes that kind of disobedience is meant to be an inspiration to others to engage in that kind of disobedience, not just for the sake of disobedience, but to see the point of the value, the moral point of the disobedience, and to be compelled to agree, and thus to change some of the mores of society. And in some cases that works, and others it doesn't. Where it works, it can have a fundamentally transformative power, sometimes for good and sometimes for bad. So I mean, I realize this, I'm not trying to be cagey, and I'm not trying to just not be trapped by a question. What I'm trying to say is that these become the political questions of our time, and you can't prejudge those. Some people, from their faith perspective, will say, I don't get involved in those questions once they become political questions. For others people, they will get involved because they see it as a religious question as opposed to a political question. But when those acts happen, they can be really important symbols, and they put people and they put issues in play in ways that are hard to predict. So I do think that there is a role for civil disobedience, and sometimes that may be religious disobedience. But it's not a role that you can say, oh, well, because sometimes that's a good thing, and because sometimes it works out, everybody's got a license to just go ahead and do whatever they want to do. I think I think anybody who is getting serious about engaging in acts of civil disobedience has an important obligation to weigh the nature of the disobedience that they're considering, and the consequences of that disobedience, not just for themselves and the people close to them, but for the wider society. And then to make a political decision about whether that particular kind of disobedience or that particular act of disobedience is the right act in the right time to send the right message, and to inspire people toward a change. And understanding that if it's a meaningful disobedience, there's going to be a reaction to it. And so I don't think it's something to be done lightly, but I don't think it's ever anything that can be ruled out. And there are some really good examples that have been mentioned already, like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. and others, where those acts of disobedience did catch on and are inspirations even to somebody like me who wasn't alive in the time that they occurred. And there are other cases of civil disobedience that I find completely disgusting, like the attack on Capitol Hill on January 6th, that, for others will be a symbol of a great motivation and some kind of change that they want to see, that I fundamentally disagree with. And and how we feel about those acts of disobedience are going to inform whether we think they're tolerable or not. But the hope what I hope that everybody can try to cling to, and something that I am motivated to cling to because of my faith, is the idea that whatever disagreements ensue around those things, ultimately, we have to approach those difficult conversations from a place of caring for those people that we seriously disagree with and whose actions we sometimes despise, and wanting to find a way to live alongside them, as opposed to just conquering them and subjugating them and imposing completely our point of view, and trying to give them the maximum amount, or to receive the maximum amount of freedom to live our lives and they to live theirs in the ways that they see fit, without imposing ourselves inappropriately on others.
I find your idea here of the importance of particularity and decision within these kinds of political decision making. That wasn't something I thought of ahead of time. That I find that really interesting. Lachlan, for our final question.
Yeah, sorry, excuse me for a second. But yeah, I feel like that this kind of question has been underlined throughout many of the questions, many of the responses that we've had throughout this evening. That question being, what do you think is the proper relationship between church and state? And Mr. Oliphant, if you could start us off with that, that'd be great.
It's Rob.
Rob, okay, sorry.
Keep doing that. I keep looking for my father behind me as you say that. I am not sure one needs to define the role church and state in that way. It exists. We have faith communities, church and other faith communities. We have a state. We will be lovers at times, we'll be adversaries at times. The state will learn from faith communities will learn from the state. It's an engagement process. When I was in the church and going to Parliament Hill and speaking to committees, both in the House and the Senate, which I did, I thought I was a prophetic voice. I'm not sure how effective I was, but I felt good at the end. When I'm in the other side of the table, on the other side of the table, and faith communities come to me as they have this week. I've met with faith communities, a variety of them. I'm interested. I'm engaged. I want their opinions. So I think it needs to, we need to keep engaging. It's different from when I was young, where decisions in the Prime Minister's office weren't made without engagement with the Christian church. There was conversation regularly in the corridors of power with the Christian community particularly. That doesn't happen in the same way as it used to, and that's probably good. But church, synagogue, mosque should not lose their place, and they should continually be engaged in these questions. We should listen, we should learn, we should respond, and we will be better for it, and Canada will be better for it. But it just is something that is. And this concept of separation of church and state, I can't do it. Within me, I have both. And I think that's a dualism that I'm not going to go to. I will try to be always mindful of my faith and mindful of my responsibility as a citizen, and keep them together.
That was very insightful, and I honestly do echo a lot of parts, because I myself am very politically active within Sudbury, but also have a very strong church background with my family and stuff like that Torrin knows very well. But yeah, I can see how sometimes you can't always separate it within oneself at all. It's more of an ebb and flow, more of a balance between the two. We're trying to stuff like that. Mr. Blaikie, if you would like to build on that.
Sure. I mean, I think I maybe make a distinction that Rob may not, or maybe he does. I find it really useful to distinguish between two distinctions. One is between the state and the church, or between church and state. The other is between faith and politics. And on the question of the distinction or the relationship between the church and the state, I have no trouble saying that I don't think there should be any, because those are institutions, and there should be no institutional link between any one church or religious institution and the institution of the state. Those should be separate. They're properly separate. That's very different from saying that there should be a complete separation between faith and politics. Faith helps inform the value. Faith helps bring some people to politics in the first place, as I was saying earlier. Faith informs the values that people bring to their politics. It informs their vision of what they want to see for their community and for their country. You can't take that out of politics. That's why something like the Parliamentary Interfaith Caucus is important, because what you need to do is to learn how to have good conversations, or to have conversations in a good way about how faith informs people's politics, and how to try and talk across differences to find that common ground in different visions for the future, and also to better delineate those differences, either so you can learn how to live with them, or you can at least learn where as a political actor you want to try and better apply certain kinds of pressure. So you're not making enemies where you don't have to, and you're actually figuring out what the crux of the real issue is. So that's where that dialogue becomes important, because I don't think it makes sense. I don't think it's possible to talk about divorcing faith from politics, but you can make sure that religious institutions don't have an institutional role in the institution of the state. Forgive the redundancies there, but I think it works. And so for me, that much is very clear. And of course, in Canada, I think at various, there is a trajectory where church and state have become more disentangled. I think that's a good thing. But that's not the same as faith and politics becoming disentangled. So what is the role of what in the Christian faith tradition we call the church in politics? Well, it's it can have a dialogue with its membership and with its congregations, and it can meet with politicians as other organizations do, and seek to be a voice, and seek to compel people, not in a coercive sense, but in the sense of inspiration toward the kinds of goals and the vision of the future that it thinks is important. To me, that's perfectly appropriate. It can be done in some inappropriate ways, but that's just true of any organization. They can assert themselves appropriately or inappropriately. So to me, that's a really core distinction, is that there's a difference between talking about the separation of church and state and the separation of faith and politics. One can and should be done, and the other can't. And so anyway, I hope the audience finds that to be a helpful answer.
I would just because you mentioned at the beginning, yes, totally agree about that distinction. That would be that, and I was really talking about faith and politics being totally blended. The problem of the institutions colliding is when I get a cardinal from one church coming in and telling me how public policy should be done because the church says it should be, and I say no, that's not what we're going to do. And a dilemma there is when churches, religious bodies, receive 29% of their funding from government, because every time you make a $300 donation to a church, the taxpayer is paying almost $100 of that. So this becomes a moral dilemma for the churches too, because a third of their income really is subsidized by the government, which someday we may need to address in Canada to figure that one out, whether that is still a good place to be. The churches should address that, I think. They need to think about that. But absolutely similar distinction, important.
All right. Well, I guess it's my turn to comment on this question and pick up and maybe deviate slightly from what was said previously. I agree that it's important to distinguish between a question of what we've been talking about for the most part in this conversation, which is the potential conflict between moral conscience and civic duty, if you like, the way in which an individual seeks to within themselves reconcile questions of faith and politics. That's one set of questions, which is different from the question of how the institutions of church and state relate to each other. I think we've had a lot of extensive treatment of this question of civic duty and moral conscience, and so I won't return to it, and we'll maybe just focus my response to this question on the question of the relationship between the institutions of state and church. First of all, obviously, in a pluralistic society, no religious institution can presume to set public policy simply because that's what it thinks. Religious institutions obviously have to make arguments in a pluralistic society in ways that are going to be understandable and accessible to other people. Now, that doesn't mean that religious institutions can't make valid arguments in public policy. Indeed, I think we all would understand that religious institutions are often at the forefront of relating to people and trying to solve the same kinds of problems in terms of human flourishing that the state is seeking to respond to. Remember at the beginning, I made the comment that I thought state and church are separate, but ontologically related. That is, often they're seeking a common purpose. So, for instance, the state has an interest in the rehabilitation of criminals, of those who commit crimes. Many churches, many non-Christian faith institutions are involved in the rehabilitation of criminals. The state has an interest in combating mental health challenges that people experience. The churches and other religious institutions are often on the front lines of counseling people who are experiencing mental health and other kinds of personal challenges. So it is not only reasonable, but I think effective and valuable for the institutions of church and state to be, in some sense, in dialogue about opportunities for collaboration in response to things that are challenges that exist within society. Yes, of course, part of pluralism is that no one institution within society should presume to dictate outcomes, but they may have good reasons. They may have good ideas to bring forward particular proposals, and there may be opportunities for efficiencies to be realized through greater collaborations. There may be opportunities in which through partnerships between faith-based organizations and the state, programs around combating addictions, rehabilitation, the advancement of social justice, programs can be realized more effectively through those kinds of collaborations. And I think we would want to emphasize a healthy pluralism, one that is characterized by a proper understanding of separation of church and state, but not in the most extreme manifestation that excludes the possibilities of partnerships that are oriented towards the common good. And when those partnerships emerge, they have to, I think, emerge in a context where the state is respectful of the identity of those religious institutions. We've had problems in recent years where the state has tried to use the carrot of Canada Summer Jobs funding, for example, to get religious institutions to sign on to commitments that may contradict their own theology. And I would suggest that is an abuse of the distinction that is supposed to exist between church and state. Of course, the state doesn't have to provide funding to religious institutions, but there, if there are shared goals and opportunities to realize those goals together, then why not, really? I mean, because otherwise we're missing a great opportunity to address things that everybody agrees we should be seeking to address. And I can't let the moment pass without disagreeing a little bit with the characterization of charitable tax receipts as somehow state subsidy for religious practice. This is a reality that exists for all charitable organizations. There are charities out there that are doing work that I might not be that enthusiastic about, that others might not be enthusiastic about. But the general principle is that when individuals make contributions to organizations that have a charitable purpose, that those individuals not pay taxes on those funding. So it's a tax break that comes back to the individual. Of course, one might argue it incentivizes greater charitable contributions. It is the government giving individuals a tax break that in effect might lead to more money going to these organizations. But the principle is that that I should not have to pay tax on money that is not for my own use, but is rather being given by me to a charitable purpose. And I think that's very reasonable. And I think that is a much better model for preserving the autonomy of these organizations than a model where various charities come to the government for direct state subsidy, because there are many organizations, maybe less likely to be in the religious space, but that are much more reliant on direct state subsidy, and therefore are much more vulnerable to transgressing the proper boundary that should exist between church and state. I see you're chomping at the bit to wrap up. I'm sorry to be over time, but thank you for this opportunity. Again, it's great to share the stage with my colleagues.
Yeah, sorry. We are sort of running just over time now, and very interesting point. I'm sorry we had to cut it short. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for the audience at home for attending this forum. I hope you learned something. I certainly did. And yes,